Okay, maybe I think you would have seen at least one link to either of the three. Kritika, Rohan, Karthi, quick yes, if you can just give me a heads up if you've taken a look. You have to just maybe unmute and tell me if we are good to go. Okay, great. Yeah, that's fine. You would find, in fact, all three videos cover different sections of the daily wage workers. The third link you'll find largely focuses on women daily wage workers. The second one, again, a couple of stories of people who might have migrated long time back, but they still do the daily travel to these unregulated labor market in the cities. So just to give you a little bit of a background, apart from what I said about the nature of the study, you would find that increasingly the impact of the lockdown and the pandemic had disproportionately affected those, as you would have guessed by now, who were part of the vulnerable unsecured workers landscape. And for those who may know, in India's context, you have increasingly more than 80 to 85% of the entire, 450 million people working in this, in this landscape, finding work for their, in some cases, daily existence, managing means for meals, for not just themselves but also their families. And in the daily wage workers category, and especially the 300 interviews that we did, and there was largely ethnographic interviews spread across weeks with the same individuals that we wanted to talk and have a conversation. There are very few voices that we could maybe archive just to give everyone a set of an idea of what the scenario was. But the purpose was to also understand how the impact and the evaluation of that impact often misses out on the details of what you'd consider as humanitarian or humanist connections, right, with respect to what individuals are facing. In fact, in one of the video essays, there is a respondent who says on how a couple of people in that market space have gone, they've lost mental sanity because of the hunger that they were facing, especially not, and this is not during the lockdown period, this is months down the line, because you couldn't find work, or whatever work you were able to find, you weren't even getting paid for that period of time. Most of these workers are engaged in jobs like construction, low-end manufacturing. It isn't a part of what you consider as the income generating segment of the economy, which is largely the service sector, as most of us know, because in urban spaces, which is the engines of economic growth, service sector led businesses have largely guided in their growth story as well. So stories matter, individuals matter, and the idea of studies like these were to basically get a more detailed perspective on not just the impact of a crisis shock on a group of workers, but also understand how lives connected with these workers start getting affected. Because just to give you a little bit of an idea, a lot of children of these workers who were studying, in some schools, government schools predominantly, and in some cases even private schools, for those workers who were able to make reasonably well a good amount of, I would say, money over a month, were able to spend some money for sending their kids to private schools. In some cases, I mean, Surat was an interesting case there. But what happened was most of these parents no longer could afford the children's education. In a lot of cases, they didn't have multiple mobile devices or smartphones, so they couldn't have even the substitution or transition to online education. The the seamless way that we could manage maybe at Jindal. But that was something which really made a lot of children to go out of the schooling base as well. And the impact was worse on girls who were asked to, in fact, undertake more work at the intra-household levels of work sharing with the other members of the family. At the same time, a lot of children started, in fact, accompanying parents to work, because in some cases they were also being asked to get whatever work that they can to be able to make their ends meet. Almost 95% of our respondents could not manage more than a meal a day, and this was the scenario back in November. So I'm talking about a time when people in the conventional economic wisdom felt that the economy was back in its shape, things were going pretty okay, the lockdown was behind us, but the scenario was not that great even then. And the study happened around that time itself. So yes, here's some few pictures that you would have been able to see on your screen. As you know, this work is produced by a part of a center's unit. The center is housed in the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. That's the reason we thought it might be interesting to showcase this work, because it's not belonging to a given discipline, right? Like, it's not that a student of economics only can do this, or a student of political science or anthropology can only do this. It's an event that's happening around us, and for those interested in studying the impact of a crisis shock on the lives and livelihoods of people, can just be part of this and get a better perspective. Now, why narratives, or why use the term narratives? The word narrative economics I've borrowed from the terminology used by an economist who's also known a lot for his work in the field of finance and economics, by the name of Robert Shiller. Shiller, in fact, wrote a paper, I think now almost 5 to 6 years back. In fact, he's recently published a book by the same title called Narrative Economics, where he studies episodes of crises, like historical episodes of crises, like the Great Depression, period around that, to understand how crises affects human behavior and how the change in impact on human behavior causes consequential impacts on the changes in the functioning of the Indian economy. Because as you would know, ultimately most of what we study, even I would imagine in the core of international business management studies, is what is ultimately shaping consumer preferences and their decisions, right? Economists largely prefer to look at data once the choice of a decision has been made, right? They don't have a very clear idea about how choices are being made or how preferences are being shaped, because there's so many things that could cause them: habits, influences on social demonstration effects. We seem to feel that we have a reasonably good idea, but to be fairly honest, we don't. And behavioral economics, which as a field emerged in this scenario, was trying somewhere to figure out, but I think it's still a little bit far away. There's a lot of work for those students who are interested in some of these scenarios in the study of the brain now, which is being called as neuroeconomics in selected universities in the US and some institutions in Europe, where I know that a lot of the study of the brain, and neuroscientists are working in tandem with economists to understand how human brain is subjected to certain changes in sensory perceptions and your choice architecture is designed. But again, that's kind of narrowing down the scale a little too much. The use of the term narrative here is in a different scenario. As I mentioned, almost 85% of India's labor market is belonging to the unorganized sector. And by the unorganized sector, we mean that there's no social protection, or there's limited social protection in some areas. Largely, people are dependent on cash for making their ends meet, and they're working on a day-to-day basis. There's not much of employment protection. However, what you need to know is that as you move towards the transition from the unorganized to the organized sector, the process of that happens not in a year or two, but through decades, right? The structural transformation takes, in some cases, generations. The only country which has been able to manage doing that within a generation is China. And I wouldn't use India for that as a reference, but maybe China is perhaps the only country where You've seen within the same generation, people have moved from, let's say, a given vocation to another vocation and have been able to manage that. But still, this is a concern which was affecting both not just India or China, but also countries like Brazil, South Africa, where predominantly, or Ghana for that matter, where predominantly most of the workers are a part of the unorganized sector. You want to know sectorally how vulnerable, the population is in terms of this category. And Crises actually did this very interesting panning out of the study just at the time. I think the lockdown was in effect last summer, where it was trying to just roughly estimate how and to what extent you will have which of the segment of the economy most subjected to the severity of the shock from the lockdown. So agriculture, industry, as you know, most people are working in part of the casual or the self-employed labor category. And what it does is it makes the situation of those a part of this group or working space much more intense. So industry, you would see that the vulnerability level was high because of the fact that, again, 80% of the industrial landscape is largely guided by the medium, small, and micro scale enterprises, which you would know was one of the major focal points of policy attention for the government as well. And most of the people employed by the MSMEs are working in the casual or self-employed labor category. So this is important to know. Why am I kind of harping a little bit in this scenario is statistically there are very little reliability or reliance on models we can use to study the impact of the shock on this segment of the economy, which is largely, as I said, the unorganized sector, because you don't have enough data to be able to study them, right? And the only way you can largely maybe come about is develop a craft and art of stories by looking into the lives of people. Of course, the size of the sample and the research methodology, I'll come to some of these points a bit later. But what narrative and narrative building does, it provides some form of a creative, essentially humanist tone to the way you undertake that study. So here is a quote from Sartre, who you must have probably heard, where he talks about how a man or a woman is always largely a teller of tales. His life surrounded by the stories and the stories of others. She sees everything that happens to him or her through them, and she tries to live her life as if she were recounting it. The role and importance of stories and the value of them not only defines or connects who we are, but it also somewhere shapes whatever we do in a day-to-day life. The kind of work we do, where we go, what we encounter, who is that is inspiring us, who is that we're being careful in terms of our social lives. So there is a lot that the use of storytelling or the importance of storytelling entails in the conduct or the propriety of our behavior. Hume, you must have probably heard, who inspired a lot of the work that Adam Smith did, and Hume and Adam Smith were part of the two critical Scottish Enlightenment thinkers back in the mid-18th century. Hume said, and this was a very interesting quote I thought of just including in here, what depends on a few persons is in great measure to be ascribed to chance or secret and unknown causes. What arises from a great number may often be accounted for by determinate and known causes. So if you find that a similar pattern of, let's say, an impact is affecting the lives of a small proportion of a given population, you may say that it may have happened because of a localized issue. It may have happened as a result of certain interpersonal, intrapersonal situations or circumstances. But if the same pattern is getting or is affecting more and more people, right, over a period of time, across cities, across culture, across different sociological classes, you'll find that there is some commonalities and there's some deterministic reasons for doing that. In fact, the very birth of the field of macroeconomics would have to be seen in context to how macroeconomics developed because of changes in the microcosmic reflection of a given entity, or I would say given group of people. Micro, as you know, studies small and individual level behavior, whether it's in respect to firms, households, a given government, or the external sector. What you do want to know and get a better perspective of is whether the change of the micro is affecting what you'd consider or is causing changes at a macro level or not. So one of the things which is very interesting with using a more ethnographic style of study of impact evaluation by looking into the stories of people and how a particular crisis has affected them is that as you talk to more and more people, if they're defining and explaining similar concerns, right? Just for an example, if everybody is saying that they had to borrow extensively to be able to finance their day-to-day means, you know that's a common problem, that household debt is increasing, okay? And if household debt is increasing, we may not know by what proportion or percentage it's impacting each and every one. We can get a probabilistic idea in percentage terms if that's the range, but we'll know that household debt is an issue. Now we know for a fact, and in fact, we wrote about this last year, that the major issue in debt composition now would be household debt as against to government or corporate debt. A lot of the corporate debt was waived off as a result of the monetary liquidity enhancing measures that the government took last year. Household debt is a big problem, and that was something which we could talk about because we were seeing this on the field, that a lot of people were concerned. And in fact, in the third video of a few women talking about their experiences, you see how concerned they are about the increasing debt and debt composition because the wages have gone down, incomes are not the same as they were before, and they're finding it difficult to work. And a lot of these borrowings are informal. That is also that they're not taking money from the bank, they're borrowing from people known to them. And as a result, it's part of a larger, more deterministic concern at a macro level as well. You don't have to look at just secondary data to get an idea of how household debt is increasing. Schiller, back in 2017, when he first wrote a paper on what we use the term as narrative economics, I think made a very interesting point, and I just wanted to kind of put in there here. Narrative may mean a simple story or easily explained expression of events that people may want to bring up in conversation or on news or social media because it can be used to stimulate the concerns or emotions of others, and or because it appears to advance self-collective interest. Quite often, such events may or may not be backed by empirical facts. You may have urban legends, in fact, what you call as rhetorical stories, which may be out in the media. You don't know whether they're true or not, but by the time it's a few days, you start feeling that it is true because of how the media is playing the situation out. A lot of that happens with respect to elections, and we've seen that on how there's a polarization behavior seen amongst voters developed as a result of sharing different forms of news. Schiller's use of the term narrative is kind of far more expansive. What we're trying to look at is just one case of here, in this case, the lives of daily wage workers. How stories about the finding of work, not getting work, is in a way daily, making them react or respond to situations in a different manner, right? So you can just maybe take a case of that. From a more academic exercise, you'll find that the use of the term narrative, which is why I'm spending a lot of time talking about it here, isn't very common to the fields of economics and finance. You'll find that if you see JSTOR and you maybe do a search, anthropology, history, in fact, are the fields that often use the term narrative and context. In fact, both these terms, context and narrative, are very strongly used in these areas because they avoid, getting into large hyper macro exercises of determining cause and effect, which I think economists and a lot of people working in finance do as well. So again, just to give you a little bit of an idea on where and how this field is being used, it's not as if that the study or the spread or use of popular narratives. Let's say that there's a lockdown in place, you won't find any job in this city. That's in fact, caused a lot of migrant workers to go back to their native towns. A lot of people couldn't stay, even if they had the money, because they felt that the lockdown was indefinite. They had no clue when this is going to be back. And in a lot of cases, when we were talking to some people, especially in Lucknow, said that they were reminded of this, kind of that horror experience of demonetization, where an announcement was made, not much of time was given for the general public to prepare, and they just had to respond, right? And that caused a lot of fear and panic amongst people that something similar has happened. You may imagine that the first lockdown that happened well before the pandemic had spread, right? So a lot of people weren't aware of what COVID was, or what the pandemic was. All they knew was that there was a lockdown in place and there's nowhere that they can buy food or they can go to work, and they have to shut themselves in. Now, many of those who were staying in rental accommodations, in fact, more than 95% staying in rental accommodation did not know whether they could pay rent. And in a lot of cases, landlords and people told them that it's better that you go back to your villages, and that's where you need to go. So this had a strong behavioral impact on most of the people around that period of time. I felt the situation would have been far worse when the second wave got hit, because of not the response to that, the second wave, which is the administrative response, but more because it caused a far higher level of fatality in terms of death. And in fact, in cities like, for example, Lucknow or Pune, there are hardly any households that did not lose someone known to them, right? So that really brought or jolted a lot of people in terms of how this would affect, their regular approach to leading a life which they would consider quote unquote normal, in terms of going to work, coming back, doing the work that they need to do. But there are controlled experiments which, in terms of studying impact and behavior of people, that very often happen in marketing. I mean, Phil would know much more on that than myself, but business studies, management studies, I think have looked into this far closely than at least the discipline of economics, or what you'd consider as the neoclassical influences in the field of economics have acknowledged. Journalism is dependent around story building, a craft, and in some cases build a narrative and hyperinflate that to the extent that you don't find resonance between the micro and the macro, and that's where I brought that relationship. Education, health interventions. In fact, the Nobel laureates Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, got largely that because of their work in applying what was a tool in medical science called RCTs, randomized controlled trials, which they extended from medical sciences to economic policy diagnosis, right? So a lot of this was something which was done to study people's perception and behavior and bias on different actions as well. So that's why the use of the term narrative economics becomes, or the use of the term narratives in terms of looking at stories of a particular group may help us, as a tool of seeing, or as an observatory eye of seeing, in case of studying the impact, let's say, of a crisis shock. And a case in point for that is what I mentioned earlier, is how daily wage workers suffered during the lockdown. And we've used the word curfew-style lockdown because many countries had lockdowns. UK had one of the longest lockdowns, but it wasn't nowhere similar in terms of its restrictions to what happened in India. In India, it was just what you'd consider as as part of the Epidemic Act, a curfew that was imposed, so you couldn't get out anywhere. So just, I don't want to kind of read anything out, but these are just facts, and you'll have presentation, a copy of which you'll have access to. This is from our essay for the Wire and Scroll that carried out a long column looking at the impact of the crisis and the lockdown on generally daily wage workers in Lucknow and Pune. And here you see data in terms of providing insights on how the impact was more or less on income. So you see that the mean monthly income from labor work only fell by around 62% based on the data that we collected from 9,500, which an average worker was earning per month, to 3,500. Now, it's interesting because when you hear Lakshmi, for example, as one of the respondents in her 20s saying in Pune, her response gave us a sense of where and how. So Lakshmi says, we did not even earn a single rupee during the lockdown, but whenever we get or could find any opportunity to go out, we had to borrow money, but we couldn't even work because we were largely beaten up by the police. Now, facts like these, it's difficult to absorb when you're doing probabilistic or cause and effect analysis through existing data. The fact that most people, even after the lockdown was lifted, could not find work was because they felt that they weren't welcomed, right, in the place, that is in these labor markets, to be able to sit there and find work. Now, this was because there was police administration, and the lockdown had created this sense of a fear of the police that if you are going to the location, again, we might get beaten up, or we might not be able to be treated to be able to find work on a day-to-day basis. Pune's situation was far worse in this regard. And I think it was very different from what was happening in Lucknow and Surat, for that matter. So some of these voices, right, some of these narratives and stories really help us in understanding why, when the unlocking process had begun, you still didn't find people getting back on their work space. Now, our survey results from Lucknow and Pune, which is what I'm mentioning only is here because I'm conscious of the time and the scope of our talk today, also revealed a sharp fall in working days. Now, this sharp fall in working days was, in our understanding, due to a demand-side shock, which was affecting the economy way before the pandemic. Because if you look at the performance of the real estate sector and construction sector, in many parts of Lucknow and Pune, many what you'd consider as investors, or those corporate groups which are investing in real estate and construction, had stopped investing new capital, right, before the pandemic, because there was a demand-side crunch. There was lesser demand by households for residential housing and other projects. And as a result of that, what was happening, that there wasn't work in the first place to be found even before the pandemic for a lot of these workers. What they were finding is they were still able to get maybe 15 days of work as against to getting 25 days of work in a month. This is pre-pandemic. Even that 15 days of work came down to, let's say, 3 or 4 when the post-lockdown period was in place. So a fall in working days, a subsequent wage shock, these are certain facts that came out from our surveys. And these are dire because, if you were finding work for 21 days and now you're able to find work for 9 days, right? You're able to basically not be having enough money to serve your family, or to be able to even afford the transport expenses that they have to incur traveling by state buses every day. Now, on this transport fact, I think that's an important point to mention. Most of these workers travel from far away from villages, and in some cases, what you consider as satellite towns. Like in Delhi, you have Ghaziabad, Noida. For a long time, these were considered as satellite towns that had larger populations in slum-like settlements, who would take some form of transport to travel into the city, work for the day, and come back, right? Now, because of ensuring COVID-appropriate behavior and low seating capacity in buses, particularly buses, which is where most people travel, the bus price for travel from point A to point B had gone up, right? Second point was a lot of them found it difficult to get even a bus or a local transport. So that made almost 30% of our respondents, which is what is the estimate we gathered, not being willing to travel to work because it was difficult to get there as against to what it was before. So Ansuya, who is a migrant worker in her 30s, says even after the lockdown, most of those of us who came from outside the city haven't been called for work. Those from outside the state are being discouraged to come and work. A few of us who managed to come here, when we sought work, prospective employers would say, you have come out from your town and would have brought the virus with you and would send us away. So there's a discriminatory attitude amongst workers who, in fact, as you would know, would belong to a low class, in some cases low caste social aggregate, and that discrimination amplified in the post-lockdown period. So some of these facts, I think, and I don't want to kind of go into the details more than this. Just the point is that as you go and talk to people, you get, I think, a larger sense of what the issue is. And when you collect data, maybe from the samples that we've collected, of course, 300 may give you a very little bit of an idea in terms of what I was saying is 80% of the 450 million workforce. And of course, the context in Bhopal or in Katni or in Rajasthan, Jaipur, Jodhpur would be very different from what you could see in Lucknow, Surat, and Pune. But one of those, the few observations that were made in terms of fall in working days, increase in hands of social discrimination, losing motivation to work, higher transport expenses, a higher accumulation of debt, a disproportionate impact on children in terms of meal, the nutritional asymmetries in terms of consumption of food. I mean, I can go on and on. All these 6 and 7 points, these are almost common to all our respondents, right? So when it is in that scale that you're seeing that there are commonalities with similar patterns that you can find. In fact, now we have from last year studies that CMIE, Azim Premji University, and others are publishing that are giving the same set of observations at a much macro level. So you can see how serious the problem seems to be. So just to come back to this point of using the role of the design of constructing narratives, and I've talked about this in the classes that I teach as well, and in fact, students who register for courses like political economy, state development, we have our first few sessions talking about the use of narratives in looking at countries as case studies, right? We can take a story of a country, look at its social, historical, and political past, and try understanding how it is different. Like in most cases, comparative politics, which tries to look into dynamics of similarities between two countries, may lose out on the granularities of Anthropocene or anthropological context building. So India and China may have similar challenges, but both have different processes in terms of moving, in terms of both legislative, judicial, policy, governance, which are very contextually dependent, right? And we can't say that just because China is able to scale up its business model very effectively, India can do the same, right? We can't. We have a very different, largely more heterogeneous labor market, very different set of preferences amongst people. So what narratives do in diagnosing and studying, let's say even economic policy, is first it puts into center a humanist perspective. You start talking to people, you start learning through their own stories and understanding what they're going through. It's a very emotionally consuming process, as a lot of you may understand, because when you're talking to people and when they're sharing, a lot of time they're breaking down. They expect maybe that you're there to help, but largely you're there to listen and observe, right? And what they're understanding. There is a contextual perspective that you can get. As I said, Pune's case was very different to that of Lucknow in terms of what was demotivating people to get back to work. So you do have what you consider in economics the word endogeneity, right? Whether you use the word endogenous in trying to understand internal factors and the use of those internal factors over a period of time. There is an agency perspective that you gather. An agency perspective means, well, you're studying the impact of, let's say, if I'm trying to study whether the food grains that the government is providing in terms of the public distribution system was actually reaching the people on the ground, right? Just as a case in point, you can gather using this narrative-based approach to get feedback from both recipients and also providers, right? Whether they're able to provide food grains to those families who need them. Just to give you a very small point, in Delhi, we found those who were receiving ration, right, from the PDS system, for them, in a lot of the parts in Northeast Delhi, they felt they couldn't go out and get, if you get gehu, for example, and I'm using India for a second, you have to use the gehu for wheat to process it, right, and then be able to cook your bread with it or cook roti. But that processing, or what we call in Hindi is chakki, right, the chakki piecemaker process, that in itself was not open. Most chakkis were closed in parts of the cities. So even when they got the ration, for them, a lot of families said this was of no good to us because we got, let's say, wheat, we got some rice, but we had nothing else as part of the pallet to be able to serve, and we couldn't even get it processed for eating purposes. That's an important agency perspective. And a lot of the people who were serving and providing that also said that, well, because the government and the union government passed this blanket government order, we have to provide it. If we don't do it, our jobs are at stake. Behavioral perspective, I've talked about it quite in detail, how your preferences in terms of choice, nature of work. In the US, you're seeing this very closely now. The US employment market right now is undergoing what you'd consider as frictional unemployment. People aren't out of a job because they don't have a job. Many people aren't working now because the nature of the job doesn't appeal to them the same way it did before the pandemic. And many places and many sectors, in hotel, accommodation, tourism, they're facing this, right? And as a result, a lot of the teenage students who are in the summer looking for work, they are being employed now because they had to fill an X number of open positions to be able to get back to business. So there is a feedback process that is created as a result of this interaction. And with that, maybe I would want to come to a pause. The idea was to just give you in these 40-45 minutes a perspective on what we've done and how this art or use of story building is so integral to even understanding and learning economics, economics of labor, economics of behavior, economics of consumer preference, economics of debt. There's so many ways that you can get a better perspective once you start getting on the field and interacting with people. There's some links that I've shared which might be of some use for students who might find this intriguing. The references to articles that we got published and the few papers that we've now got out, they've been accepted, can be shared later on. But just for those to get a little bit of an idea on what we were saying and what the sources of this information was, you have these links in front of you. All right, so I'll pause in here and maybe the last, 20-25 minutes of time, what we may want to use, we can use for discussion.
Thank you, Dipanshu. That was extremely insightful, right? And while the students, I'm sure they have questions, thoughts, observations. I was particularly struck by, the use of narratives and your second last slide about the humanistic, the contextual, the agency, and the behavioral aspects. Very, very interesting, very, very interesting approach, I would say, and perhaps lends itself to a variety of situations and contexts, right? Fantastic. Just wondering, you mentioned Pune and Lucknow. There was some comparison of data between two cities. Did you see any similar trend in other parts of the country, like Surat was a city that you studied?
Surat was similar. I think we didn't have a large enough sample like Lucknow and Pune. So when we were in the process of writing with media form of snippets and articles and columns, you can be a little less, considerate of sample sizes. But with research, as you know, with academic journals, they're very particular. There's a unit homogeneity in terms of samples. So we chose Surat to be out from our textual analysis, oral and oral, which in terms of photo essays and the video essays that you see, Surat had a very similar scenario. I think Surat, we got a very useful understanding of what was happening from the MSME form. The factory workshop owners who you were dependent on labor, which was migrant labor, low-income migrant labor from Chhattisgarh, UP and Bihar, largely we were coming in from, how these, what you'd consider the managers or private contractors, how they were affected. So we got some useful insights. So whatever little I was mentioning about how the industry sector was so vulnerable and they found itself to be difficult to get back to business because of two, problems. One is, in the case where labor came back, to the workshops, demand was low, and demand was low enough, which wouldn't, make sense for a lot of the workers, even if they wanted to come back, to be hired back, in that segment. And in some cases, what the scenario was where demand was high, a lot of the workers who were able to move, interestingly, they weren't being hired at the same wages that they were being paid pre-pandemic, which a lot of workers, in fact, the second video essay link that I shared, there's a person who talks about the need for unionization. It's a daily wage worker who has no education. This fellow would have been educated till third or fourth grade, but he understands the value of unions because he said that we need some kind of a collective bargaining process in these labor mandis so that we can, say that, like, at least pay us what you were getting paid, before the pandemic. So a lot of the private contractors also use the pandemic narrative, or the story around the pandemic. And this from what happens in the IT sector, right? I know of a lot of things in the IT sector when there's a recession, a lot of promotions get suspended, and just the narrative and the story around a downside of a business cycle is used, right, for getting a lot of the work done. So the observations that came out now, I mean, this study was done back in November, but the work that we did with other projects, right, this was daily wage workers. We did a 3-month-long study in Kapashera, which is, I think you would know, it's a slum-like settlement in lakhs of population. It's what you'd consider as a mini Dharavi of Delhi and Gurgaon, the border area. So Kapashera's observations were in symmetry with what we found here in November. Our observations from going back to 2 other places, Katni and Jhansi, and Bhopal, which is a project that we've just completed. They are more or less similar. In fact, they are far more graphic in the sense of our understanding. The second wave has really eroded confidence amongst people, especially the vulnerable workers. They're not very sure in terms of what they can do. The impact on women has been very, very hard. I mean, they've been really hit hard with this, because we were working right now with domestic help workers in 5 cities, right? So just so in terms of observations, again, Lucknow, Jhansi, Katni, Bhopal, and Patna. So, I mean, the observations from either these cities also in terms of income consumption disparities, the debt question, which I mentioned very consciously, is affecting everyone amongst these groups. But the commonality is all of them are part of that, which the pie chart I showed. They're largely part of the unorganized informal segment.
So, do the students have anything? So, Dipanshu, and as you were